Welcome. Today we're going to discuss the technique reigning claw and some of the more important principles, concepts, rules, theories, and strategies of the technique. So let's start out at the beginning. Remember, one of the things about Kenpo is that we're learning concepts, principles, and rules so that we can apply them effectively in a combat situation. So what does that have to do with this technique? Well, this technique can start in different places. We could start in a non-ready position, a semi-ready position, or even a fully ready position. So why does it choose to start in a semi-ready position? Well, that's going to bring us into one of the concepts that we're learning in this technique. That's called gauging. We're going to be gauging the distance or the range between us and the opponent and trying to maintain it throughout the whole technique where we can use it effectively. Okay, but what does that have to do with starting here? Well, this brings in the concept of economy of motion. If you think about it, we are in the perfect example or position so that we can not have to worry about what we're doing on the top and be able to focus on what we're doing with our legs. So remember, rule number one is establish a base. So does that mean we step back or do we step forward? Well, yes, the answer is yes. Why? Because it doesn't say establish a base by stepping back. It says establish a base. This is where reading comes in. I have to read the situation. What is my environment? Am I stuck against a wall and I can't step back? I can only step forward? So all these things have to be part of your considerations. So now that we've established that, let's actually move forward to what we're doing. Why are we doing this block this way? Well, remember, we're learning rules. And typically, we have a rule when we're dealing with a punch on a horizontal. And that is, anytime that we're blocking on the inside of the arm, we're blocking at or below the elbow. This is no different. We're showing you how to do the vertical version. The interesting thing to notice is that we're still creating this plus X. Why? For margin for error. So can we do the same thing on a vertical? Well, yeah, as soon as he comes in, we're doing exactly what we just did on a horizontal, vertically. We're blocking on the inside of the arm, below the elbow, making that plus X. But this is going to bring in another concept, margin for error with timing. So instead of focusing on the physical, where we're actually making the contact and making a wider margin for error, we're now doing it conceptually for timing. He might have been a lot quicker than I thought about dropping this hand, but notice what I'm doing with my left hand. My left hand's already got a cover so that I can anticipate for that timing and pick up that margin for error. But this is going to bring in a concept, line of sight and weapon obscurity. In other words, if you think about it, I don't want to have two of my hands occupying the same zone at the same time. Or another way to think about it, I don't want to get in my own way for what I'm going to be doing next. So why can I get away with having the cover higher than this? Well, remember, he's doing an uppercut. His strike is coming up. So by having my hand higher, I'm actually blocking the punch and not putting my hand lower, where it's going to allow the punch to come in. So now that we got this out of the way, let's talk about one of the main objectives of Kenpo, rounding off corners and elongating circles. So if you look at our follow-up moves, what are we doing? We're going to be delivering a heel pump and a claw. But notice how I just did that. I did that in a line. What did that create? It created that corner. We went straight and then down. That creates that corner. So let's fix it by doing a circle. Well, notice what happened. We're not obeying economy of motion. Our hand's actually going in the opposite direction of where it wants to go before it ever gets to our opponent. So again, this is how we fix it, by following that objective, elongating circles and rounding off corners. Another way to think about this is we're turning a basic into a sophisticated maneuver. So rather than having elemental moves where we go straight with the heel pump and then down with the claw, we're going to combine the two. Another way to think about it is a sophisticated basic is a singular maneuver with multiple effects. So the idea here is to eliminate the and then, round up the corners, and elongate the circle. But notice what else we're doing. Gauging. Remember, this whole technique is designed to teach us gauging. And just like we gauged at the beginning with our feet, we're now gauging with our hand. This helps me put the opponent where I want so I could be at the proper range or distance to hit my opponent with the follow-up maneuver. In other words, let's assume I hit him really hard and he starts to back up. See, I can no longer touch him, so I know that I'm not going to be able to reach him. This brings in the concept of foot maneuvers are added as needed. So in the event that I do send him back, I can easily just step and control my gauge so that I can effectively deliver that final maneuver. But this is going to bring in the concept of point of view. There's first person perspective, second person perspective, and third person perspective. Right now we've been talking about first person perspective, in regards to keeping line of sight. I want to be able to see what I'm doing. But we haven't talked about weapon obscurity. In this case, from a second person's perspective, I want to eliminate their ability to see what we're doing so that we can take advantage of it. In this case, two ways. One, by physically hurting them, hopefully breaking the nose, getting their eyes to water, and clawing their eyes. But second, by actually keeping our hand blocking his view so that we can use our other weapon. This is going to bring us another concept, a strike. In this case, the vertical back knuckle thrust. So I thought this was an uppercut. Well, no, actually, remember, Kenpo is designed to teach you different options. From a second person's perspective, they are doing an uppercut punch. Punch because they're using the front of the knuckles. We are doing a vertical back knuckle thrust because we're using the back of the knuckles. But keep in mind that all punches are strikes, but not all strikes are punches. But now that we're here, we got to the end, there's one more thing we need to consider. Typically, our techniques are designed to show us the long versions of the techniques. But this is a beginner technique, so if you notice, it's very short. In other words, it's almost like a technique leg. Well, so what does that mean? Well, that you can easily extend it by adding a standard extension. But sticking to the ideal phase of the technique, what was one of the major concepts? Gauging. Well, just like we've been gauging offensively, we also need to learn how to gauge properly defensively. In this case, by doing the cross-out and cover. In other words, we're creating 1.5 of our distances or our stances to create distance away from the opponent. But this brings in one more concept, environmental awareness. The whole reason we're doing the cover out, besides controlling that gauge and creating more distance away from our opponent, is to also surveillance the environment so we can get 360 degrees view of the environment. So now that we talked about the rules, concepts, principles, theories, let's actually demonstrate it once fairly slow so you can see it executed. We hope this video helps you understand the American Kenpo system a little bit better. Thank you very much.